The biggest nuclear disaster in the history of mankind happened 37 years ago, today at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union in what is now Ukraine. An event that was absolutely tragic, but has fascinated scientists endlessly ever since, and the more we research it, the clearer it becomes. Even today, decades later, something is happening at Chernobyl. Be sure to stay tuned to join me in unraveling the radioactive mysteries, and if you like it, I'm galactically happy for a thumbs up and a comment, because that way the YouTube algorithm will show this video to even more people who will then learn something. Thanks a lot guys and welcome. It's been almost 40 years since the Chernobyl disaster, and today I'd like to combine the most exciting videos I've created so far on the subject of radioactivity into one supercut for you. Together we will clarify what is up with the ominous fungus that grows in the reactor of Chernobyl and feeds on radiation. We will clarify why the dogs in Chernobyl have changed genetically and are undergoing a particularly rapid evolution. And we will travel together to the most dangerous room of the entire Chernobyl power plant and look at the deadly and bizarre elephant foot. We will also, to fully understand the power of nuclear fission, take a side trip to the so-called demon core, the core of an atomic bomb that killed 2 scientists. I promise you, this will be extremely exciting. But before that, a little preface about nuclear power itself. Because I keep reading comments like, Chernobyl is the best argument against nuclear energy. Modern nuclear power plants are immensely different from the Soviet technology and bureaucracy in Chernobyl. Such an accident would have been unthinkable in German AKWs, which have now been shut down. If you add up all deaths from form of energy, really everything, from radiation deaths, to cancer deaths, to deaths from coal burning, to deaths from falling off the roof while attaching a solar cell, nuclear power is by far one of the safest form of energy. Sounds strange, understandable, because the reporting of many media, especially in relation to Fukushima, can only be described as simply wrong. The number of nuclear deaths caused by Fukushima is still 0. In Germany, on the other hand, politicians often use the number of tsunami deaths and simply relabel them as nuclear victims. The German energy turnaround has so far made Germany one of the biggest climate sinners in Europe, as we can see on this nice CO2 map. France, on the other hand, which relies heavily on nuclear power, is very climate-friendly in terms of CO2 emissions. The shutdown of the last nuclear power plants in Germany 6 months ago also did not lead to increased energy production through renewable energy. No, it was almost completely replaced by coal-fired power and of course imported nuclear power, as you can see here right now. All publicly viewable, all crystal clear with numbers provable, but in Germany unfortunately somehow irrelevant. Last year I did a little poll on the channel whether we need more or less nuclear power. 11,500 of you participated and 78% of you voted for more. Feel free to write me your detailed opinion in the comments. Nuclear power, yes, please, or nuclear power, no, thank you. What would be the right way for Germany? I am super curious what you think. But always remember to discuss objectively, people. So that as a small preliminary skirmish, now we finally travel together to Chernobyl and the topic of radioactive mushroom will act as an introduction. It is now more than 35 years ago that it came to the reactor accident in Chernobyl. That was 5 years before my birth. Write to me, who of you was already on the world and perhaps even consciously witnessed the whole thing. In the Ukrainian city of Chernobyl there were 2 explosions in the nuclear power plant, which destroyed a reactor block. This in turn led to the release of radioactive material into the air, which spread through large parts of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and other parts of Europe. On this map, here we see how the radioactive clouds spread across Europe from April 27 to May 6, 1986. The inhabitants of Chernobyl and the nearby town of Pripyat were evacuated and the area was considered uninhabitable for decades. Today, a few people actually live there again and there are even tourist tours to the area. I was also in Kiev once a few years ago and had considered doing that, but then I figured I'd rather not compromise my procreative ability with radioactive radiation. After all, I've got lots of little astro babies to father. Of course, at that time the environment, flora and fauna, in the area around the nuclear power plant was also considerably burdened by the radioactive radiation. Over the years, radiation levels have decreased, and so nature has also recovered, but the following find is still extremely astonishing. researchers found a black fungus in the area that feeds on the radioactive radiation. Its name is Cryptococcus neoformans, and it grows not somewhere in the forest, but just there, where there is the highest radiation in the reactor block. This hungry organism not only defies the high radiation level, it lives on it. NASA radiation scientist Kasturi Venkateshwaran says, the mushrooms collected inside the reactor had more melanin than the mushrooms collected outside in the exclusion zone. They were found to have grown toward the radiation. They love it. So we're really talking about an absolutely extraordinary life form here. The fungus thrives on the remains of the reactor block. It can decompose radioactive material, such as the hot graphite in the remains of the Chernobyl reactor. In the presence of radiation, the fungi grow faster. They align themselves with the radiation source to grow there, as if reaching for their food. That life thrives at the site of such a catastrophe, of all places, is incredibly fascinating. Reminds me strongly of this quote from Jurassic Park.
Life will not be contained. Life breaks free, it expands to new territories, and it crashes through barriers painfully, maybe even dangerously, but finds a way.
But how does the fungus do it, and could we possibly even use this for medical treatment or even space travel? Yes, but first things first, the black fungi have a very high level of melanin, which is the pigment in human skin that protects against ultraviolet radiation. The low melanin content is why the paler among you look like a tomato after a day at the beach. Mushrooms can use their melanin to convert gamma radiation into chemical energy for growth. I'm sure this reminds some of you of the plant photosynthesis process, and it is similar. Analogous to photosynthesis, it's called radiosynthesis. Molecular biologist Arturo Casadeville says, we started by exposing the fungi to radiation. We found that they grew faster, which was related to melanin. If they didn't have melanin, you couldn't see the effect. And now think about how ingeniously you could use this mushroom for the most diverse things. In principle, it is a natural radiation shield due to its radiosynthesis. Very practical for all people who often spend time in space, because cosmic radiation is radioactive and very dangerous for the human body in the long term. That is why the mushroom has already been cultivated on the International Space Station of the ISS, because they want to use its amazing properties for space travel. The experiments on the ISS are intended to show whether it is possible to protect spacecraft against penetrating radiation. In this way, because in the area where as it moves, the radiation is higher than on the Earth's surface, but still at an acceptable level. If at some point humans will set off on missions deeper into space, for example to Mars in the next few years, then they will have to withstand massive radiation exposure, and that's where the Chernobyl mushroom could be of perfect help if, for example, this mushroom were grown in the outer walls of a spacecraft. Biologist Radames Cordero says, we know that space radiation is dangerous and damages matter. If you then have material that can act as a shield against radiation, it could not only protect people and structures in space, but also have very real benefits for people here on Earth. I know sounds totally science fiction is, but real research reminds me a bit of the spore drive from Star Trek.
Go!
It also occurred to me that this could be an interesting aspect of the search for extraterrestrial life. If they can already form such life forms on Earth, this means that also extremely radioactive exoplanets cannot be excluded concerning the existence of life forms. A planet that is completely covered with an alien fungus. An absolute paradise for pizza fungi fans. But space travel is only one area of application. The black fungus could also be used in radiation therapy to protect patients from the negative aspects of radiation. Or one could surround nuclear waste repositories with layers of this fungus. The possibilities are truly endless. In principle, the mushroom could even be used to generate electricity. We could generate green electricity from radioactivity. There are many places on Earth that naturally have immense radioactivity, such as the Iranian city of Ramsar. Hot springs exist there that bring radium from the rock underground to the surface. The radioactivity there is 20 times the global average. Such places would therefore be predestined for mushroom power plants to convert this radioactivity into energy that we humans can then use. All still music of the future, but I find it super fascinating to think about what you could use this mushroom for. Feel free to write me in the comments what other use cases you can think of for the black fungus. I don't know about you guys, but this whole thread has made me hugely hungry for pizza fungi. And it just so happens that I have a slice right here. It's incredible that life can adapt to even these most adverse conditions, isn't it? And you don't even have to travel that far to see radioactive life forms like this. In Germany, in Saxony, there is a disused uranium mine. And what researchers have found there is at least as exciting as the Chernobyl mushroom. If we look at the list of the largest uranium producers in recent years, we see that Germany has been at 0.0 tons of uranium mined per year for some time. What's going on there? In the GDR, uranium was actively mined at the Königstein mine in Saxon, Switzerland, and exported to the Soviet Union. Since 1990, however, the mine has been at a standstill. Now some smart Alex among you will say,
"But in the table I saw that Germany produced uranium much longer."
in fact, a certain amount of uranium still accumulates during the rehabilitation of old mines, such as the one in Königstein. Since the mines were closed down, attempts have been made to clean the mine water by dissolving the uranium from the contaminated water through filter systems. And the uranium extracted from the water can of course be sold as a nice side effect. Meanwhile, the amount of uranium in the mine water of the Königstein mine is so small that nothing worth mentioning can be extracted from it. The last load of uranium slurry, weighing 19.5 tons, was shipped to the USA in 2021. I do wonder on what platform uranium slurry is sold. eBay? Well, it sounds like that's the end of the story. The mine water purification is going according to plan, the uranium is sold and the mine itself is flooded, so peace, joy, uranium cake? Not so fast, because the Königstein mine still holds some shining secrets. How researchers found out scientists wanted to find out what flora and fauna had formed down there. Such a flooded uranium mine is literally the wet dream. Of every biologist, how does life fare in a wet underground biotope with high radioactivity? Pretty well, as we now know. Check out this shot the researchers took of the mine. It looks like a real microbial party. And indeed, what's hanging off the walls are microbial life forms. On the walls, the researchers found orange acidic microbes that look like long thin worms, and from the ceiling, they made slimy brown and white formations that look like stalactites. It's all starting to look like something out of an alien movie. But it gets even crazier. According to the published research paper, not only bacteria and archaea live in radioactively contaminated environments, but also species of eukaryotes, clearly indicating their potential impact on carbon cycling in an environment affected by acid mine drainage. In other words, life down there is very diverse, and the mine inhabitants are, above all, amazingly complex organisms. Most of them are not dinky single-celled organisms, but multicellular eukaryotes, organisms with a nucleus that are capable of more complex things like respiration and cell division. Incidentally, the largest of these microorganisms in the uranium mine was 50 micrometers wide and 200 micrometers long, which would be visible to the naked eye. Someone should urgently produce a movie called Attack of the Radioactive Mine Slime Worms. Would watch it. The question, after all, is how these organisms manage to thrive under the extreme conditions. The key is the low pH, high sulfate concentration, and high concentration of heavy metals in the mine. I know it doesn't sound really comfortable now, but for microorganisms it's like some kind of 5-star hotel, because many of the bacteria there are acid-loving. They gain energy by feeding on the abundant iron and sulfur supplies in the mine. These very acid connoisseurs form the slimy stalactite structure found on the ceiling of the mine. To us, these slimy deposits look so a bit gross, but to eukaryotes, it's a stellar dinner par excellence, as they feed on this acid-loving bacteria. And even larger multicellular organisms, they in turn feed on the eukaryotes. This process continues, forming an extremely efficient and well-organized food chain system in the mine. The only question is which creature is at the top of the uranium mine food chain. The study states, eukaryotes colonize extreme habitats to a greater extent than thought, and may play an essential role in carbon cycling in acidic mine water environments. So a radioactive, flooded, abandoned mine is a place where life can thrive beautifully. But I can already hear some of you screaming.
What does this have to do with space? Tim is only allowed to talk about space.
This discovery is super exciting in terms of the search for extraterrestrial life. because it does show that life is very resilient and can adapt to the most extreme conditions. And where are the conditions often very extreme? Correct, outside of the Earth, everywhere in space. After all, there are really many places in our solar system alone that could be potential habitats, but were previously considered unlikely to harbor life because of their seemingly hostile conditions. On Venus, for example, it rains acid. As we now know, however, an acidic environment is not per se hostile to life. If life on Earth can thrive in environments that are literally corrosive from a human perspective, we must also include extreme locations in our search for extraterrestrial life in the future. For example, exoplanets that are completely radioactively contaminated or exoplanets with huge oceans of acid. All conceivable, and in fact a new study suggests that even exoplanets far from their stars may harbor life and oceans, if enough energy is generated by radioactive decay. The study, which I've also linked you to below, says, the presence of a liquid solvent is widely considered to be an essential prerequisite for habitability. Our analysis suggests that super-Earths with radionuclide abundances more than 10 to the power of 3 times those on Earth can host long-lived water oceans. So you see, such discoveries as in the Königstein mine in Saxony therefore provide super important implications for the search for aliens. Around Chernobyl, of course, live not only small creatures like mushrooms, but also larger mammals, especially a growing population of dogs. When I first reported about these dogs, I donated €100 for them and promised to donate another sum for every 1,000 views that the video reaches by the end of March. 50 more cents. Since it has reached 182,000 views by the end of March, that would have been €91. I rounded up to 100 and donated to the Chernobyl dogs. But what makes these dogs so special? The thousands of evacuated people at that time had, of course, many dogs. A large number of these dogs were left there in a hurry and in need. Now one would assume that these pet dogs left behind would not have lasted very long in the vicinity of a damaged nuclear power plant with immense radiation exposure. However, many of them survived, multiplied, and today there is a relatively large population of dogs in the Chernobyl area. They are doing so well, they are really radiating. Okay, that joke was mean. These dogs are very mysterious, because although it is very likely that these are pets of the evacuees, there are also people who think it is unlikely. This is because the Soviet armed forces actually exterminated all the pets left behind in the first days after the nuclear disaster, to prevent them from escaping from the nuclear power plant and spreading the radioactive contamination. Wherever they come from, the dogs are there now. And for scientists it is of course extremely interesting to take a closer look at these Chernobyl dogs. How do they manage to withstand the still high radiation exposure? What has changed in their bodies as a result? Exactly, we now know thanks to a new study, and the result is really spectacular. The dog population there is genetically different from all other dogs in the world. Sounds almost like the plot of an apocalyptic horror series. Nuclear irradiated dogs change their genetic makeup and then take over the world. It probably won't be that drastic, but the research results are nevertheless quite significant. The researchers have been collecting then samples from the stray animals for 2 years, and have been able to study a total of 302 dogs living within the power plant itself, and at a distance of 15 to 45 kilometers from the disaster site. That there really are families of dogs living inside the power plant building, I find super fascinating. That's the view of Elaine Ostrander, a geneticist involved in the study, who says, the most remarkable thing about the study is that we're identifying populations of dogs living in the shadow of the reactor, and we're able to identify those dogs based on their then profile. The thought of families living near spent fuel rods is incredible and speaks to the resilience of dogs as a species. Overall, the new study showed that this population has 15 complex family structures that are unique compared to other dogs. This means that Chernobyl dogs can be uniquely identified by their DNA and distinguished from other dog populations. According to the researchers, this is due to the ionizing radiation to which these dogs have been exposed for generations. During the accident in 1986, the deadly radioactive isotope cesium-137 was released in immense concentrations in the vicinity of the power plant. So for now, it's not surprising that this has done something to the dogs over the generations. But how, specifically, can radiation change DNA? When radiation acts directly on DNA, It can change the structure of the DNA double helix by breaking the bonds between the nucleotides that make up DNA. When radiation affects chromosomes contained in DNA, it can even cause chromosome breaks, and radiation increases the overall mutation rate. Mutations are changes in the DNA sequence that make up the genetic material of an organism. When a mutation occurs in a gene, it can lead to altered protein synthesis, which in turn can lead to changes in the function and characteristics of the organism. Mutations don't always have to be a bad thing. In fact, they play a big role in evolutionary biology. You should always remember this when you drink a delicious and healthy glass of milk. By the way, this video is not sponsored by the dairy industry, unfortunately. Lactose tolerance is a genetic mutation. Our ancestors were all lactose intolerant. It took a mutation to enable our ancestors to digest lactose and, of course, that was an immense survival advantage at the time, because it ensured survival by increasing the food supply, and that's why lactose tolerance prevailed quite effectively in evolutionary terms. Which mutations the Chernobyl dogs may have developed and whether there are also advantageous ones is now to be clarified by further tests. The only thing that is clear is that the mutation rate must have been quite increased by the radiation exposure, and that the successful thriving of this dog population at least speaks for the fact that they have adapted to the conditions by mutation. But I want to emphasize again that mutation and evolution in general do not follow a plan. I still remember how my bio teacher Mrs. Hoffmans always drilled this into me back then. My bio grades were nevertheless bad. Certainly many Chernobyl dogs died early and in agony because of bad mutations, and just because they died, they could not reproduce and could not pass on the bad mutations. Dogs that were particularly well adapted to radiation exposure, either through beneficial mutation or simply through better physique, were able to reproduce, and so over the generations a particularly radiation-resistant population of nuclear dogs was created. Just like giraffes didn't get a long neck because they found it convenient to get the leaves, but because the primordial giraffes with a slightly longer neck got more food and therefore, instead of starving, could devote themselves to more pleasant things like reproduction. I'm sure Mrs. Hoffmans would give me a D- for this video. What kind of mutation could have helped the dogs, for example? The researchers think they might have experienced genetic changes that improved their ability to repair DNA damage, which is a super important factor in coping with radiation damage. This research could then also be important for people who live in areas with high radiation exposure or in space travel, because in space, radiation exposure is also very high. Elaine Ostrander says, "We can learn so much from these animals. This is a unique opportunity to see what happens when generations of large mammals live in a hostile environment." The whole thing is also super interesting regarding a scientific theory called radiation hormesis, according to which low levels of radiation exposure can actually be beneficial to health. Low doses of ionizing radiation, below the threshold for acute damage, can stimulate the immune system and improve DNA repair processes. Some studies have shown that low doses of radiation may reduce the risk of certain cancers, and have beneficial effects on the immune system and metabolism. In another study with dogs, it was found that the life expectancy of dogs increased significantly when they were exposed to low doses of radiation throughout their lives. I know that sounds incredible and goes against pretty much everything else you hear, but the study evidence is relatively clear. I've linked you to a lot of sources on radiation hormesis in the show notes below, so I don't get a shitstorm. Of course, not only the milk lobby did not sponsor this video, but also the nuclear lobby does not pay me a cent. Unfortunately, some lobby has to pay me some money now, damn it. So the dogs survive there, and possibly thanks to beneficial genetic mutation and even slightly positive effects of radiation hormesis. Of course, this does not mean that the dogs are doing well there, especially since the war in Ukraine there are hardly any tourists in Chernobyl. That's right, you can book tours there. Fewer tourists means less food, because the dogs are then brought less on site. The research team that conducted the DNA study is working with the Clean Future Fund, which is trying to help the Chernobyl dogs with donations. So we see, the power of radioactivity is enormous and even affects them. Of course, it is also highly dangerous, and no story demonstrates that more perfectly than that of the Demon Core, an atomic bomb core that took the lives of 2 scientists. Buckle up tight, because this story will blow your mind, I promise. Triggering a lethal radiation chain reaction in the core of an atomic bomb by the wrong use of a screwdriver. This is not one of my silly jokes, but really happened. But take it easy, let's start at the beginning of the story. World War II ended shortly after the American atomic bombs were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, it was not clear that the Japanese Empire would surrender then, and that is why they were working on a third atomic bomb in the USA. The core of this atomic bomb was a 6.2 kilograms plutonium sphere, which today is called the Demon Core, and it really earned this nickname, as you will hear in a moment. First, yes, there is the question of why the US kept this plutonium core in the first place after World War II.
You never know when you might need the core of an atomic bomb. I always carry one too.
Research on nuclear weapons continued after the war, and although there has not been a wartime deployment since, there have certainly been deployments. Testing was originally to be used as part of Operation Crossroads, a series of nuclear bomb tests conducted by the US to study the effect of nuclear weapons on warships. 2 nuclear weapons tests, named Able and Baker, occurred as part of Operation Crossroads. These tests took place on Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. It may sound familiar to you, and no joke, presumably the makers of SpongeBob really wanted to make an allusion to this with the name Bikini Bottom. In the end, however, the Demon Core was not used in such a test and was melted down beforehand. And this was probably because of the tragic events it triggered. The first accident happened on the 21st of August, 1945. The physicist Harry Daghlian conducted an experiment aimed at determining the critical mass of the plutonium core. This means he wanted to find out how close the core was to the conditions for a self-sustaining chain reaction. This is crucial info for understanding neutron physics and how nuclear weapons work. We'll take a closer look at exactly what such a chain reaction is in a plutonium core in a moment. Harry Daghlian built tungsten carbide blocks around the Demon Core to study its critical mass. Wolfgang carbide is a material that reflects neutrons, so in this experiment it acted as a neutron reflector around the Demon Core. Here you can see a replica of the experiment and the tungsten carbide blocks around the plutonium sphere. By surrounding the plutonium core with tungsten carbide, one increases the number of neutrons in the core that are needed to maintain a chain reaction. Of course, Daghlian did not want to achieve a critical chain reaction, but to find out how the Demon Core would react by adjusting the number of tungsten carbide under safe conditions. But what happened next is truly inconceivable. Harry Daghlian accidentally dropped a tungsten carbide block on the Demon Core. After what we just discussed, you can imagine what that triggered. The core was suddenly brought much closer to critical mass. An uncontrolled chain reaction was set off and immense radiation was suddenly generated. Harry Daghlian immediately removed the block to stop the reaction, but in that short time he was already exposed to a lethal dose of radiation amounting to almost 5.1 sievert. Less than a month later, he died of radiation sickness. Now, one would think that after this incident, safety precautions were increased at Los Alamos National Lab, where the accident happened. Not really, one has to say, because less than a year later, on May 21, 1946, the next tragic accident happened, the sequence of which really sounds even more inconceivable. The physicist Louis Slotin, by the way a good friend of Harry Daghlian, was working on the Demon Core. The experiment he conducted was called tickling the tail of the dragon, and somehow exactly what you would expect to happen when you tickle the tail of a dragon happened, namely, a catastrophe. Heard right, from the nuclear fiasco and his own death, Louis Slotin separated only a screwdriver between the two hemispheres. It's kind of a macabre thought, but with something like this I always think to myself that it's no wonder that men on average live shorter than women. It finally happened as it had to, and the screwdriver slipped from his hand. The two hemispheres completely enclosed the Demon Core and another critical nuclear chain reaction unfolded. Colleagues of Slotin later described a blue glow around the core, called Cherenkov radiation, which is also visible in nuclear power plants. Slotin further felt an acid taste in his mouth and a burning sensation in his left hand. And although Slotin quickly separated the bullets again, thus ending the supercritical reaction, it was unfortunately already too late. He died of radiation sickness just 9 days later. Two incredibly tragic and bizarre accidents, and what I find really tragic about them is that both Daghlian and Slotin, as experienced nuclear physicists, probably already knew at the moment of the accident what that brief moment of carelessness would mean, namely, their own death. Let's take a look at how it can be that through seemingly so small mistakes the radiation exposure directly becomes so immensely high. First of all, the chain reactions that occurred during the fatal accidents with the Demon core were not strong enough to cause a full nuclear explosion. An operational nuclear bomb contains many more elements than just such a plutonium core, for example, reinforcing explosives. So the Demon core was never on the verge of nuclear explosion, but reached a state that is called critical. In that case, literally, it must be said. In such a state, an independent chain reaction occurs in which the number of neutrons in the material can stabilize or even slowly increase, but not as rapidly as in an uncontrolled, explosive chain reaction. Very roughly speaking, what happens is this. The chain reaction starts when a neutron enters the plutonium nucleus and is picked up by a plutonium-239 atom. This turns the plutonium-239 into plutonium-240, and that is unstable. What happens to your life when you are mentally unstable? That's right, it completely disintegrates into its component parts. Somehow this is a really depressing video. Therefore, the plutonium-240 then decays, splitting into two smaller atomic nuclei, so-called fission products. During this process, which you surely know better under the name nuclear fission, a large amount of energy is released in the form of heat and gamma radiation. Now you could say, well, then a little energy is released, but then it's over again quickly. Unfortunately, neutrons are released, which in turn hit other plutonium-239 atoms and also split them, releasing even more energy and neutrons. You can see where this is going, an exponentially stronger chain reaction, and that's exactly what happened in the few seconds that the two researchers each had their neutron-reflecting mishap. So the Demon core story clearly shows the immense force we are dealing with in nuclear fission. As frightening as it is fascinating. But the topic is also relatively complex, so feel free to write any questions you have about it in the comments, and I'll try to answer as much as I can. Promise. What is the situation with radiation in Chernobyl today? In fact, it is much stronger in some places of the power plant than in others. There is one room you should not enter under any circumstances, room 217.2, which contains the bizarre and deadly elephant's foot. Want some proof photos? Here are the original shots of the elephant's foot. To deal with the Chernobyl accident, a sarcophagus was built around the damaged reactor to prevent further release of radioactivity. However, this old sarcophagus was rather makeshift and was then replaced in 2016 by a new protective shell called New Safe Confident, which shields radioactivity much better and is also equipped with all kinds of instruments and cameras. The need for this new shell is controversial, by the way, and some radiation protection experts believe that the radioactivity level is now low enough to continue using the old shell. Others say that a new hull is appropriate simply because of the danger that the old hull could collapse due to a natural disaster, an earthquake or similar. Whoever was right is irrelevant, because the radioactive drop has been sucked and the new shell has been in place for several years. But what is undisputed among all experts is that there are still isolated places in the power plant where the radioactivity is still extremely high. Therefore, here is an important tip. If you should ever accidentally get lost in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which could happen if you mumble in the travel agency again, under no circumstances go to room 217.2. This room is about 15 m southeast of the damaged reactor and 6 m above the ground, and in this room is the elephant's foot. Unfortunately, not one of those, but one made of highly radiating material, a fused mixture that could still kill you with its radiation today decades after the accident. Here you can see a shot taken by Arthur Korniev, a high-ranking employee during the planning of the new shell. We don't see a ghost here, but Arthur Korniev in an early form of a selfie, taken with a self-timer. Impressively visible is the elephant's foot, basically a large radioactive blob, a dead monster born of the reactor accident. But what exactly is the elephant's foot made of? When the meltdown occurred in Reactor 4, which also caused a radioactive fire throughout the building, immensely high temperatures were created. Due to this extreme condition, the building's construction material, i.e. mainly concrete, steel and glass, melted with molten nuclear fuel. So it is not an exaggeration to say that the elephant's foot is a spawn of nuclear meltdown. The molten material that results from a nuclear meltdown is called corium. A portmanteau of core and the suffix ium, typical of chemical elements, meaning the core element. So corium is the molten fuel composed of uranium, zirconium, graphite and other materials that is created when the fuel element of a nuclear reactor melts and mixes with other materials in the reactor vessel. And I can promise you, you don't want to mix this stuff into your coffee, because once it's formed, it's incredibly hot, radioactive, and can even eat through walls, as we see impressively at the elephant's foot. You remember, room 217.2 is 15 meters away from the reactor. Up to here the corium could penetrate and produce this spawn of hell. Instead of the foot of a nice pachyderm, the thing reminds me rather of an abscess, with its meanwhile black coloring and wrinkled structure. It also fits that the elephant's foot is just one part of a much larger mass that extends under the room to below Reactor 4. Creepy. And I don't know about you, but I feel a morbid urge to touch this thing and learn more about its consistency. Kind of like plutonium, check this out. Looks kind of yummy. Could taste like orange and we'd never know. We do know quite a bit about the consistency of elephant's foot, though. Maxim Savelyev of the Institute for Nuclear Power Plant Safety Problems said, in the beginning, the elephant's foot was so hard that scientists had to use a Kalashnikov rifle to break off a piece for analysis. Now it has more or less the consistency of sand. The forbidden sand we must never build a sandcastle out of. Now, yes, the question is, how dangerous is the elephant's foot today? We have already seen people with protective suits entering the space and taking photos. Here's a video taken in 2007 that feels like a clip from a found footage horror movie. We also see that the whole room is full of radioactive debris. At the time of discovery, shortly after the nuclear disaster, the radioactivity near the elephant's foot was about 8,000 to 10,000 roentgens. An intensity that within a few minutes causes radiation sickness so severe that it inevitably leads to death. Since then, radiation has decreased massively due to the decay of radioactive elements. But before you go packing your bags right now, that's not a free pass to room 217.2. According to a 2019 estimate, radiation levels in the immediate vicinity of elephant's foot are still around 40 sieverts per hour. I've also seen other sources, like this Reddit post, where it's estimated at 1 X-ray per hour, so over 100 sieverts. Either way, I wouldn't risk anything, because that's still a very high dose of radiation, which causes radiation sickness and can also be fatal if you're exposed here unprotected for long periods of time in the room. Whether and how many people have caught radiation sickness from the elephant's foot and may have even died, no one really knows. There still exists this mysterious picture here, taken before the well-known photo of Arthur Korniev by an unknown photographer. Some think it is a fake, because the photographer is not known and nothing is known about the photo. At that time the radiation level must have been still very high, so one can only hope that if the photo is genuine, the photographer was aware of this and wore appropriate protective clothing and spent only a short time in the room. Of course, much more of this radioactive debris exists in the ruins of the nuclear power plant and, of course, radiating stalagmites and stalactites melted all through the walls of the building. At this point, it is also worth remembering the workers who helped to secure Chernobyl for the first time after the reactor accident, and put in place the first sarcophagus. Many of these people worked in the most adverse conditions, without proper protective clothing, and it is now known that some of the workers died of radiation sickness. Even today, the elephant's foot is a clear memorial to this sad historical fact. I hope this little excursion into the world of radioactivity has fascinated you as much as it has me. Short note that I am close to the 1,000 subscribers. So if you watch this video and have not yet subscribed or know science-loving friends and relatives, I would be galactically pleased if you help me to display the YouTube Geiger counter soon 1000. Thanks a lot, guys. A very different form of energy, but potentially with even more destructive potential, lies dormant beneath Yellowstone Park. If the supervolcano there blows up, we can say goodbye to human civilization in its present form for the time being. And indeed, there is much to suggest that it would soon be time for an eruption. But NASA has developed a plan to save us. Everything about it and when we have to expect an eruption, you will learn in the next video. And if you want to support my work, treat yourself to the shirts from the videos, plush black holes or real meteorites in the space store. Every purchase helps me a lot to keep the channel going. Otherwise, I'd say see you in the next video. Take care, guys.